Now then, now we're live. Now we're live, so just remember that. I set out some more water and drinks over here, coffee. Help yourself if you want anything. The restrooms, I think everybody knows what the restrooms are to go through and around. So anyway, so this is our last lesson for our spring Bible study time. Next Tuesday, May the 7th, will be our combined gathering, our meal down at Buffett Heights at 6:30. We may do some Q&A there. We'll see how it goes. But I definitely want you all to be thinking about what you've learned in these lessons that we've done so far. What was your favorite chapter or incident or event? Anything that you want to share. I would really like some time of sharing next week. So be thinking about that. We'll pick up our studies again probably in mid-September, Lord willing. We always want to say Lord willing. We'll begin with a review for any new ladies that will be joining us, and for the rest of us that will need to be reminded of what we've covered. So, but as I was planning these lessons last Christmas and then getting through December and starting in January, my goal was, I never know when I'm going to need a babysit. We knew we'd have to have a couple of weeks out for spring break and for the election. We never know what winter is going to do, if we're going to have to miss for snow and all that. But my goal was to get through chapter 11. And that's where we are tonight. I am so thankful that we got there, because this is a good stopping place. And so we'll see as we get through this how this is a great place for us to pick up next time. So in reading chapters 10 and 11, we're going to cover both chapters. We'll not do all of 11. We'll sort of hold off on Shem's genealogy unless we have lots of time left over, which I don't expect. But these two chapters. So as you read these two chapters, what did you learn? What surprised you? What questions did it raise? We'll pick up a little bit with verses 25 through 29 of chapter 9, because we really didn't have time to do that last week. But some of the questions you may have, we will answer as we go along. Some of your questions, you may want to ask them when we get to that point. But just anything you want to share about reading this.
It was interesting, and I know we've talked about this before, that when they named, their ages and when they died, in general, the years of life is decreasing.
Yes.
Within this period.
Yeah. And what did you see different about the genealogy in chapter 10 versus the one in chapter 11? We don't give any ages in chapter 10. We don't. We got a list of names, just like when you get to First Chronicles. When the genealogies are given in First Chronicles, we're not given any ages there. We're just given, lines. And like it is in Matthew 1, when we have Jesus' genealogy from Abraham, we're not given any ages. But in chapter 5, we were given ages. And like I said, at the end, or the second part there of chapter 11, we'll be given ages again. And when we do, we see, yes, they are greatly decreased. I wrote that down somewhere. I think it went like from an average of 900 years that they lived in chapter 5, and the average that they lived in chapter 11 was 200 years. So, yeah, a great difference in average age. Yeah,
I heard a theory on that. If you listen to Andy Woods.
Oh yeah. I've been listening to him some,
but he had a theory that the dome was over, and when it opened up, and all the rains fell. He felt that dome, when it was full, blocked out a lot of the harmful rays of the sun or whatever and everything. And when that dome then was gone, that was empty as well. So there were more instances of illness or whatever because of that dome.
Anything, not only the sun, but anything else that could get through. Most of the commentaries agree with that thought, that's what caused it. Not only that, but also the fall and the deterioration of the earth There are those things. So, more pathogens are able to live and multiply. So there's a lot of different things going on. Although the fall took place in chapter 3, still up until the flood, things were, there wasn't that catastrophic change that took place as with the flood. So yeah, that's probably the reason. Yeah. What else?
I found it interesting that the whole reason they wanted to build a tower so that they would not be scattered across the earth.
Yeah.
And God's like, well, I'm going to scatter them.
Yeah. We talk about recompense a lot. Everything that, that someone does, and then that's the very thing that they get judged in. That's their very judgment, which is true with that. But not only that, but God had said, scatter. Oh, no. We don't want to scatter. You're going to scatter. Yeah, so yeah, that was kind of comical in that regard.
Well, I also thought in chapter 10, when they talk about the descendants of Shem, they don't give any ages.
Well, in none of this they don't give ages right. In chapter 10.
In chapter 11, they do give ages for him.
Yeah.
Is that because he's the favored one?
That's because that's the line. Just like they do in chapter 5, we're talking about the line.
Okay.
Yeah. So, in another reason for that is as just like we saw with chapter 5, it's to create a chronological order. So we can judge times, how long this took place. I'm such a nerd when it comes to that in details. I start setting and I forgot to make you a copy of that thing. But anyway, when I sit down and start listing these out, actually, you believe it or not, Noah was still alive when the Tower of Babel was being built. Noah lived 350 years, and if you start calculating out these ages, he was still living. I mean, that just amazes me. Shem, we'll see later on in Genesis, we'll know Shem was still alive when Abraham was on the scene. In fact, many people think that Melchizedek was actually Shem. So, I mean, that fascinates me. What else?
I'm glad we got away from using those names.
What names?
Those names.
I thought you meant, you mean we're not naming people that anymore. Yeah. I thought, no, you ain't heard me butcher them yet. I'm not away from them yet, yeah, me too. So, well, if you have thoughts, if you have questions, just, ask your questions as we go along. As I said, we want to pick back up with verses 25 through 29 of chapter 9 because we didn't have time there. But actually, Jan, the question that you had about Cush's family, we talked about last time. We'll hold that till we get down to Cush's line where he goes. Cool. But these, the question, of course, comes up. So regardless of what happened in verses 22 through 24, whatever it was, we had different ideas on that. Our commentaries and teachers differ on that a little bit. But regardless of what that was, when Noah woke up, he prophesied. He prophesied over his 3 sons' descendants. Now, the question, of course, comes up is why did he single out Canaan of Ham's sons? Well, that may have something to do with verse 24, but then again, this is a prophecy. And when we get to the end of Genesis, the rapture doesn't happen before then, but when we get to the end of Genesis, we see that Jacob, on his deathbed, prophesies over his 12 sons. And he says things about them that go way on into the future, into the coming of the Messiah. So this is prophecy. This is not vindictiveness on Noah's part. That has nothing to do with it. He's stating facts. And he says, cursed be Canaan. A servant of servant he shall be to his brothers. And that phrase, your translation may read that differently, but a servant of servants, when you see something that's written that way, a something of a something, that's a superlative. That's a superlative phrase. We think of Holy of Holies. King of kings, Lord of lords, vanity of vanities, servants of servants. It's a superlative, meaning he will definitely, he not only will be a servant, a slave, he will be his entire family. There will be a multitude of slaves. And when we get in, well, we won't get into that in Genesis. When you study in Joshua, when they go into the promised land, we see that they are told to wipe out all the Canaanites. But of course they don't do that. They say, oh, we can make them our servants. We can make them our slaves. So it's a fulfilling prophecy. Whether they remembered that, which I highly doubt, but it fulfilled as a prophecy. So he shall be a servant of servant to his brothers, meaning both to Shem and to Japheth. Then in verse 26, Noah also said, blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. And that prophesies what will take place in when they get into the land of Canaan in the promised land. And we'll talk more about blessed be the Lord of Shem a little later. Then verse 27, may God enlarge Japheth. Now, Japheth, as we'll see as we go along, would probably land-wise was a larger area of land than either of the other two. As we see we get down through there, you and I are probably from Japheth. So we think of how it's spread out, so a much larger land mass. So may God enlarge Japheth and let him dwell in the tents of Shem. In other words, may they have fellowship together. And over the years that has happened. We could go down a rabbit trail of talking about how Europe and places like Turkey, how these others were close allies with Israel over the years up until about the past 100 years or so. And so, but that would happen. Japheth's descendants would dwell in the tents of Shem. They would have fellowship. And again, Canaan will be his servant. So Canaan's going to be a servant to everybody. And so then, as we talked last time, and Noah lived 350 years after the flood, and the only thing we know about him in that whole time he lived after the flood was that he got drunk. That's the only thing we know about him. In fact, if you didn't calculate out the ages, you wouldn't know that he was still around when we get to the Tower of Babel. And so all the days of Noah together were 950 years, and like everyone else we read about in chapter 5, and he died. So then, let's see, I was going to ask, wait a minute, I've already lost my place. I'm already only on page 1. So primarily though, why was Canaan cursed? I believe primarily in God giving this prophecy to Noah, it was because that line of Canaan would be the line that would have the most interaction with Shem. Of all the others, of all the descendants, of all the different ways and places they would go, Canaan would be the one line that would have the most interaction. And so I think in God's timing and in God's prophecy, that was the reason that he was singled out. Plus, the Israelites, remember, we keep going back to this, this is written for the Israelites. This is compiled and put together. These things were probably kept in records, but they were put together. Moses compiled them for the Israelites. And so the Israelites are reading this, or they are hearing this, and they're sitting right there looking at the land of Canaan, just across that Jordan River. And so they begin to understand that this is why God said, you must wipe out all of these people. The further they go along, the more they learn about it, the more that they will understand. You know, and we hear all the time, why were they told to kill everybody? The children, the animals, everything. Well, when you know the whole story, you understand why. Just like with a cancer, or with someone who has diabetes and loses a limb or something. It has to be cut off in order to preserve the life. And so that's the reason. So other nations, the people of Canaan had become, by the time we get to the Israelites reading this, as Moses is compiling this, as we said, the Israelites are preparing to enter the land known as Canaan, not Palestine. We'll talk about that later. But the people of Canaan had become a vile people by the time the Israelites were hearing this. Actually, all the nations, every nation that we read about here had become worshipers of false gods and sexually immoral. But it was the Canaanites who God would remove from their land. Other nations would be conquered at different times, but no other nation would be removed from their land.
Were they the most wicked?
I don't know that you could say most.
Okay.
I really think that if you studied other nations, I mean, just think about what we do know about the Babylonian nation, what we do know about the Egyptian nation, what we do know about the Assyrians and the vile things that they would do. So no, the Canaanites were not more vile than any other group, but they were the only group into whose land Israel would go. And so that's why they had to be removed. So there was this prophecy, and the prophecy then would lead into the chapters of 10 and 11. So we read that prophecy. So now we come to chapter 10 and the next Toledot, or the next section, the records of the generations, that's the Toledot that divides out these. This is number 4, the 4th Toledot. And this section will run to chapter 11, verse 9. And within this Toledot, we have the genealogies of Noah's 3 sons plus 2 seemingly unrelated incidences. But actually they are quite related. So, but within this Toledot, we have the transition into what's known as the patriarchal period. The patriarchal period, it's called this because every family, every clan is ruled by its patriarch, its father leader. Just read the book of Job. Job, we know, took place during the patriarchal period because Job was the one preparing sacrifices for his children. He was responsible. He was the head of the clan, C-L-A-N, it's called, and of his people. And as for the other people, it's called, this patriarch, this father leader, this era or this period in history for Israel will carry on until after Joshua's life, until the time of the judges. Then it will change for Israel. It will go into the period of the judges. But for these other peoples and these other nations, the patriarchs will transition into rulers, into kings, the monarchies. The monarchies go by generational rule. So they would transition into that, but it was still a patriarchal system. You may have noticed that chapters 10 and 11 seem to be out of order. Mm-hmm. And actually, this is once again an example of something that the Bible often does. Actually drives the critics crazy. I had a guy come to me once and he was trying to disprove the Bible and he said, well, chapter 10, it's talking about all these different nations and all these different languages and that don't even happen until chapter 11. And I said, yeah? Did you ever hear of a summary or an overview? I mean, and we see this over and over and over through Scripture. If you know much about Scripture, I mean, we've already seen this in chapters 1 and 2. Chapter 1, the whole creation, the account of the week of creation, the 7 days of the week of creation, and then chapter 2 pulls out day 6 and gives us details on day 6. It's exactly the same thing. But we know, even if you didn't know that, you should know it by chapter 10 being an overview simply because of what we read in verse 5, verse 20, and 31 and 32, where it says that these families or these nations were listed according to their families, according to their languages, by their lands, and by their nations. I mean, that just makes sense, but we don't get the detail of how any of this happened until chapter 11. Chapter 10 is called the Table of Nations, and Karen and I were talking about this earlier. She's got a really good chart in her Bible. I kept looking for a map and a chart and I didn't have time to create one. The only thing I found that was halfway decent, and almost all of your Bibles will have a map in the back of it that shows it, but none of my maps were very good, not good enough to print and share with you. I did find this one and I'll hold it up again later. It's decent, but still, look at how much green ink and yellow ink and all that it'd take to print that off. So, and black and white wouldn't do any good. But, it's hard to find a good chart, but it's called the Table of Nations because all of these people, all of the nations of the world came from these people. And this tells us that all these peoples were created by God. We begin, of course, with Adam and Eve, and then followed one line down in chapter 5, one line, one after the other, all the way down to Noah. But now we have, in chapter 10, we have Noah and his 3 sons. I keep wanting to say my 3 sons. That sort of dates you from that TV program. Noah and my 3 sons. But Noah and his 3 sons. But we see how these 3 sons go out to all the nations. Now, I won't say everyone, but almost all the names in chapter 10 have been found in archaeological discoveries, and most of them appear somewhere else in Scripture, in the Old Testament, either as a person's name or as the name of a place. We read over these a lot of times. When I was trying to remember what it was we were studying. I think it was one of the prophets. I don't remember which one it was, but we kept reading this stuff, and none of it made sense to us just reading over it until you took these names of places and went back and saw what happened at that place. Then it made sense what was said. But you can find these names and places. In fact, that'd make a great project for somebody for this summer. If you ain't got anything else to do, a good place to start is Ezekiel 38 and 39. In fact, I've got it somewhere else down in here, but I'll go ahead and share this. That John Barnett that I shared a lot of his videos, he has a great video on Ezekiel 38 and 39 that he traces all the way back to here, to chapter 10, to who these nations are. If I remember, I'll try to put that in the email. But, fascinating. It's fascinating study. But Thomas Constable, in his commentary, said that the Table of Nations in chapter 10 is a horizontal genealogy rather than a vertical one. I thought that was a really interesting way to put that. Chapters 5 and the last part of chapter 11 are vertical in that it goes from father to son to father to son to father to son, straight down one line. In chapter 10, we're going this way. And in fact, if you look at my Bible, I draw a circle like around Cush, and then I've got lines drawn out to all Cush's descendants. Then I take the next person and lines drawn out to him, because it takes all of the children, all the sons, and then tells about their sons. So it's a horizontal genealogy. He said its purpose is not to trace ancestry. Instead, it shows political, geographical, and ethnic connections. So that's the purpose. Also, you may have noticed in chapter 10, as we've talked about already, no ages of the men are given. And it's just made up of people whose names and nations and places that we recognize for the most part. But cities, peoples, and nations, anyone you see today came from one of these 3. I mean, that when you just think about that realistically, that is amazing. And I asked you on your question sheet there, I said, I asked you if you knew the name of any place that was once an actual person.
Egypt.
Huh?
Egypt.
No, I'm talking about locally.
Oh, here?
Yeah, here. Huh? Sevierville. Yeah, Marvel. Yeah. Sevierville. Knoxville. Maryville. Morristown. Newman Lane. Every time we mention that, somebody says, oh, you got your own road. Heard people driving like they own the road.
Hey, I own that road.
I own it. But we will read later in Genesis that Jacob went to Haran to escape his brother Esau. Well, Haran was the name of his great uncle who died as a young man. But he went to the place named Haran, and it was actually his relative. So, but it all begins in chapter 10. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these names and places. And like I said, that make a great study in itself. And this is where I've got it. John Barnett has great videos on that. But there are historical documents that you can access today that documents these names. We have the works of historians such as Herodotus. I don't know if you've ever heard of Herodotus, but he was a Greek historian who lived about 500 years before Jesus. He has the history on these names. Josephus, who lived about 70 years after Jesus, lists these names. And believe it or not, the Kremlin in Russia is one of the best places in the world if you wanted to go to Russia today. But it's an excellent source of this historical documents tracing Russia's history all the way back to the one that it goes to. Fascinating stuff. John Burnett talks about that on the videos. I didn't just know that. That's where I learned that.
Well,
but
Andy Woods does that.
Yeah.
God, may God push.
But Barnett does a better job of it than Woods does. I mean, it is great. But the record here begins with Noah's sons, and I'm just going to read these aloud. I read these and give a little info as we go along. If you know something else about them, feel free to share that or jump in if you found something else. So first of all, verses 1 through 5. Now these are the records of the generations. This is the Toledot of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the sons of Noah. The sons were born to them, and the sons who were born to them after the flood. So it starts with Japheth. Now, my opinion is that Japheth is the oldest, Ham is the youngest, and Shem is the middle child. There are differences of opinion on that. Now, Andy Woods has a different opinion on that. That's just my opinion. That, of course, really doesn't matter. They are listed here. Shem is listed last because, save the best to last. Or he's the line up through which the Messiah will come. But the sons of Japheth were Gomer, that's the area of Turkey, Magog, which is Russia, Madai, which is, we know the Medes, like the Medes and the Persians, it's the Medes, Javan, which is the Greeks, and Tubal, I think that's also in Turkey, Meshech is also in Turkey, and Tyrus. And so that's the sons of Japheth. So you pull out of that Gomer. The sons of Gomer was Ashkenaz, that's where the Russians come from, the Scythians. And Rifsath and Togarmah. Togarmah we know again from Ezekiel 38 and 39, that's Turkey. So then we pull out Javan. The sons of Javan were Elishah and Tarshish. We know Tarshish. Where's Tarshish?
Turkey?
No.
It's
Spain. Spain. Remember Jonah? Going to get away, going to go to Tarshish. Kittim, which is Cyprus, and then Dodanum, wherever that is. And these people from the coastlines, let me not lose my spot over here. From these, the coastlands of the nations were separated into their lands, every one, again, according to his language, according to their families, into their nations. Japheth's descendants settled north. You can see on this map the orange here at the top. If you can't read it in that far, you can just see the color. Japheth settled into the north. That's more the European nations. They would also, the Greeks and the Romans, the Europeans, as I said, most of us come from Japheth. They also settled around the coastlands of the Mediterranean. The islands, particularly there, is where they would come from. So then, next is Ham. Verses 6 through 8 is Ham. So now we have the sons of Ham. The sons of Ham were Cush. That would go into, let me read it. Cush, Mizraim, Put, and then Canaan. So, and also the sons of Cush were Seba, Havilah, Sabath, and I can't pronounce that, Ramah and Sabtath. And their sons were Sheba and Dedan. Most all of Cush's descendants, right in the middle of the list of Ham's descendants comes a curious detail about Ham's grandson. But we'll talk about him in a minute. But Ham is the green area. Most of Ham, they did settle here in what we know as Canaan, but most of them went into Africa and Egypt. And so the question comes up. In fact, this had been used through some older history that's why Ham's descendants were to be slaves, because they were black. That is not why they were to be slaves, but that was used as a convenient excuse.
Mm-hmm.
But they did go into Egypt, and we know that actually the Israelites were made their slaves. It does include Egypt. Cush is, Moses married a Cushite woman. Cush is in other places in Scripture. In fact, your translation may say Ethiopia, but it's the upper area of Libya, or Sudan, or actually Sudan. Put is the area of Libya, and then we have Canaan, and then it goes on to the other sons there. Any questions or comments on those sons or any of that?
Who was the king later who God told him not to go down to Cush in Egypt and get help from them right at the end of the kings?
Oh, I can't remember. Well, that would have been during Jeremiah's book.
Yes,
that would Zedekiah was the one. Yeah,
Okay.
God told him not to go down there. Yeah. So all of these keep coming up, and we keep seeing these interconnections. But the closest connection will be with Canaan.
Another explanation of why the people of Africa were not slaves is because Ham was not the one that was cursed.
Exactly. Yeah.
It was Canaan. So.
But don't let the truth get in the way of a good explanation.
That's right.
Yeah, it was Canaan, exactly. None of the rest of them were cursed that way. And none of the rest of them it said that they would be servants of servants. Just Canaan. And of course that prophecy had to do with the promised land. Exactly.
So Canaan must have been alive while Ham and Japheth went into the tent.
Oh yeah. Probably was. He is.
Because I'm trying to put all this in.
Let's see. 1, 2, 3. He's the fourth son of Ham. In fact, when in verse 24 of chapter 9, it says when Noah woke from his wine, he knew what his youngest son had done to him. Mm-hmm. So we read that as youngest son being Ham, but many commentaries say that actually is speaking of Canaan, because it didn't have to be their own son to be called their son. If they called their grandsons their sons, but. So we really don't know there. There's a difference of opinion on that, but still, he's the one.
Because there had to be a long period of time.
Well, it tells us.
And all that other kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And they were fruitful and multiplied.
Oh yeah, they did do that. So okay, so we got the sons of Ham, and. Verse 7, the rest of the sons, these are the sons of Cush, the firstborn. So Ham's sons are Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. He had 4 sons. Verse 7, these are the sons of Cush. So it pulls those out. Then, and by the way, Sheba and Dedan in verse 7 is also mentioned in Ezekiel 38. Mm-hmm. We know that's probably the area of Saudi Arabia and Jordan today. We know that they are the ones that when the Gog and Magog battle takes place, that they won't participate. They'll just sit back and say, "Oh, you shouldn't do that. Why are you doing that?" So interesting. So now verse 8. Now we have one more son of Cush. Chapter 7 gives us 5 of his sons, but now verse 8, we have one more son that's singled out. And we get a little bit more detail about it. So right in the middle of the list of Ham's descendants comes this curious additional information about one of Ham's grandsons, Nimrod. So in just reading through the Bible, in times past, or if you're just reading through and you read all that and go, well, that's interesting. I wonder why that's there. We may not realize the importance of why something is there. As I've read this in the past, that's what I thought. In fact, as I was putting your sheet together for this lesson, I thought, okay, we have genealogies in chapter 10 with one interesting detail, and then in chapter 11 we have an interesting detail with some genealogy. Did not realize at that time the connections between these two things. There is a great connection. I just thought, well, that's strange, just to give this little bit of information about Nimrod, and went on, didn't think much about it. But now, as I've studied it, I see the significance. As we said before, chapter 10 is just the overview. The first part of chapter 11 is the detail or the actual event. Nimrod is important because, spoiler alert, it is Nimrod that instigates the incident of the Tower of Babel. Yeah, I did not realize that until I studied this. I'll tell you how we know that in just a minute. But let's talk about the man Nimrod. Nimrod's name means, let's see. Let me go back to where I'm at. Make sure I've got it together. Okay. Nimrod's name means we shall rebel. So that reminds you right off the bat of Cain and his grandson Lamech, who also rebelled against God. Lamech had 2 wives. God said to be one man for one woman. Cain rebelled. God told him he was going to be a wanderer, and what did he do? First thing he did is he built a city and named it after his son, Enoch. But why? You think about Nimrod, and his name means we shall rebel. Why in the world would a man name his son that to start with?
How do you want to start it out?
Well, you want to start something. Look at whose line it is. It's Ham's line. That entire line is a rebellious people. Not only was Canaan one who was out of line, we might say, so was Cush. The whole line had a rebellious attitude, and all of Ham's descendants would be adversaries to the Israelites. Now, Canaan, as we said, has the direct adversarial connection because of the land of Canaan. But as we said earlier, there's Egypt, and there's all of that adversarial stuff going on. So the whole line is adversarial to the Israelites. And remember this, the Israelites would recognize all these names as they're hearing them. So then Nimrod is described in verse 8 as being, he became a mighty one on the earth. The King James says he began to be a mighty one on the earth. And that word became or began to be is the same word that we saw in chapter 9 verse 20 when it said that Noah began farming. And we were like, look out, that's a word, that's an ominous word. When you read that word, you know something's up. Something is about to happen. Be aware or beware of what follows. It can't be good. He became a mighty one on the earth. The word mighty is important. That's the same word that we saw back in chapter 6, verse 4, when it said the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore many children to them, and here it is. Those were the mighty men of old, men of renown. Same word. The word means powerful or well known, but it also means to be a tyrant. One who, when we studied in chapter 6, we said it was like a bully. It's a tyrant, one who controls other people. So Nimrod became or began to be a mighty one, or the NIV says a mighty warrior on the earth. He was a man of might and power. And then verse 9 gives us even more detail. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. And if that wasn't enough, therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. Everybody was saying it. Not was it you would just say, it didn't just describe him. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Everybody said it. He's a mighty hunter before the Lord. So the word mighty shows up again. But what's the big deal about being a mighty hunter? The New Living Translation, I was looking at different translations just to get an idea of what others were saying. The New Living Translation just says, he was the greatest hunter in the world. And you picture him there with his musket and his big lion or elephant or whatever it was he killed and however he killed it. No, that's not what it is. That's not what kind of hunter he was. The key there is the phrase, before the Lord. The word before means in the face of the Lord. We might say he was in God's face. He was a mighty hunter in your face. He was in God's face as a mighty hunter. That's not a good thing at all. So Nimrod was a mighty hunter in God's face. The Targum, which is a Jewish paraphrase of the Old Testament, describes Nimrod as being powerful in hunting and in wickedness before the Lord, for he was a hunter of the sons of men.
Betty?
Yeah.
On my Spanish translation, it reads that Cush was the father of Nimrod, who was known as the first strong man of the earth,
Yeah.
who became a mighty warrior.
Yeah.
Before the Lord.
Yeah. Yeah. So he was powerful in hunting and in wickedness before the Lord. He was a hunter of the sons of men. In other words, he didn't hunt animals. He hunted men. He was a tyrant, and he killed anyone who got in his way. Mm-hmm. But probably the most important thing we know about him and the most easily overlooked thing comes in the next verse, in verse 10. And it says, and the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, or Babylon, which however your translation reads it, Babel. And Erech and Akkad and Calneh in the land of Shinar. All right. So he began building his kingdom in Babel, or in Babylon. What do you suppose that kingdom contained? A tower, maybe? Maybe a tower? Maybe that detail that we see in chapter 11? But he began a kingdom. And by the way, this is the first mention of the word kingdom in Genesis. You know, we've talked so many times about the first time something is mentioned, the very first use of the word kingdom. And we could go way down a rabbit trail here into the difference between kingdoms, the kingdom that comes from Babylon and the kingdom that comes from God. And where was this kingdom and these cities located? In Shinar. The word Shinar shows up all throughout the Bible as a place that is in opposition to God and God's people. By the way, the word Shinar is the Hebrew version of the Greek word Mesopotamia. It's a word that means between the rivers. It's a plain between the rivers. That's what Shinar means. This is the beginning, this is the first world empire. They might say the first New World Order is set up in the land of Shinar. Daniel was taken into captivity in Shinar. The last world empire to be set up will be in the land of Shinar. Zechariah 5 verses 5 through 11, prophesies about that last empire, and Revelation 17 and 18 describes it. Babylon the Great.
Harlot.
The great harlot, but the great city. It's the last empire. The first empire in opposition to God was set up in Shinar. The last one to be set up in opposition to God will also be in Shinar. So, before we get too involved in the details, verse 11 of chapter 10 tells us, and from that land, from Babel, from Shinar, he left that land and he went into Assyria, about 200 miles north. And when he got there, he built Nineveh, the other great empire that would take Israelites into captivity, and Raboth, Ir, and Calah, and Rezin, between Nineveh and Calah, that is the great city. So, why do you suppose Nimrod left that kingdom he had built in Babel? Got bored with it?
Just after God discovered.
Reckon it had anything to do with that confusion of languages? So he goes somewhere else?
He's no longer understood.
Right. I told y'all, I said in the famous words of Josie Wells, reckon so. Reckon so. That's where he went. And that's why he went. So, and then the genealogy.
He couldn't speak to anybody.
No, well, he had his own, but that's all he had.
Yeah.
So, and then chapter 10, the genealogy picks back up with another son of Ham, Mizraim, which is, some of your commentaries may actually call it Egypt, verses 13 and 14. And Mizraim became the father of Ludnum and Anamim and whatever these others are, and 14. I'm not even going to try.
The Ites.
No, these are not ites. We're not to the ites yet. This is the M's.
Mine calls them ites.
Yeah.
Oh, really?
Ites
No, they're
and
not ites yet. They're M's.
Yeah.
And anytime you see I am on the end of a Hebrew word, it's plural. So this is all of these. But one there in verse 14, from Cashulim comes the Philistines, and so they also are important in Israel's history. And then we have Canaan's descendants. And now this is where it changes. It changes from land names to tribe names with Canaan's descendants. Down through verse 20. And Canaan became the father of Sidon. And you remember Tyre and Sidon, you know where that is up on the coast. Sidon is firstborn, Heth, and here's we have the Ites, the Jebusites, and the Amorite, and the Girgashites, the Hivite, the Arkite, the Sinite, the Arvites, Zemarite, Hampanites, and afterward the families of the Canaanite were spread abroad. And the territory of the Canaanite extended from Sidon, as you go toward Gerar, that's in the north, as far as Gaza, that would be up in Syria today. As you go, and then down south, you go towards Sodom and Gomorrah and Admah and Zeboim, and we see all of those names of those cities mentioned when Lot is taken out of, or saved out of Sodom. It says as far as Laish. So this is the Canaanites, Cain's descendants, come down and gather here at the end here, but they're here and then over here more into Egypt. So but Canaanites are all connected on that very small area. So these are the sons of Ham. This is our summary statement. According to their families, according to their languages, by their lands, and by their nations. So much of Ham's family goes to the east, the south, and the southwest into Egypt and Africa, except Canaan, who settles in what is called Palestine by most people and on most maps. And I've shared this before, but for those of you who don't know, the land was never called Palestine until 140 AD, when the Roman Caesar Hadrian put down a revolt by the Jews, and he actually plowed up the Temple Mount. You couldn't tell there had ever been anything built there at all, and he renamed it Palestine after the Philistines, who were Israel's most hated enemy during David's time. That's the only reason.
Now, who is that? Who was that did?
Hadrian, the Roman Caesar Hadrian, about 140 AD. But your maps, even some of my best maps will say Palestine. I go through and mark it out. Right, Israel in there. So it's not Palestine, it's Israel. So now verse 21 picks up with Shem's line. And from Shem, this is really interesting. I didn't really realize. I should have, but it just didn't sink in. From Shem, we get the Semitic tribes. When you hear anti-Semitism, that's not just, we always just say that's Israel, but that's not just Israel. All of these are Semites. Anyone that's from Shem's line is from the Semitic tribes. The word Shem means the name. When we read back in chapter 9, verse 26, where it said, Noah also said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem," what he is actually telling us there is that Shem believed in the Lord God. When he said, "Blessed be the Lord," he's not blessing God. He's blessing the fact that Shem believes it. He's blessing the Lord God of Shem. What he's telling us is Shem believed in the Lord God. And so we have that line. And so he believed in the Lord just like Noah did. So now we focus on Canaan as being cursed, but the important part is that the Lord God was the God that Shem worshiped. But out of all these people, out of all of Shem, all these people came out of Shem, but like the descendants of Seth in chapter 5, verse 3, not all of them followed the Lord. We know that most of them didn't, only one line did. So verse 21 says, "And also to Shem, the father of all the children of Eber." Now it mentions Eber here. Eber will actually be Shem's great-grandson. Why does he throw that in here? He does that probably because Eber was well known, for one thing. The Israelites actually, especially, would know who Eber was because it's from the name Eber that we get the word Hebrew. So they would have understood that. So he throws that in just like Canaan is thrown in at other places because they would recognize that name. So to Shem, the father of all the children of Eber, his great-grandson, and it says the older brother of Japheth. Now, this translation says the older brother, or it can also read the brother Japheth, the elder. And again, so differences of opinion on their birth order. But beginning in verse 2, in verse 22. So these are Shem's descendants, beginning in verse 22. The sons of Shem were Elam, that's where we get the, can't say it right. Amalekites, Elam. It just won't come to me. And then Asher, that's the area of the Assyrians. Arpachshad, Lud, which is Lydians in the south, and Aram. Actually, Aram, Balak was from Aram. You remember Balak, the
donkey,
or the one that went to get Balak. And then the sons of Aram were Uz. That's where Job lived, in the land of Uz. And Hul and Gether and Mash. And Arpachshad picked him up. Now he became the father of Shelah, and Shelah became the father of Eber. So now we know he's the great-grandson. And 2 sons were born to Eber. The name of the one was Peleg. I can't say that without thinking Peg-leg.
Me too.
Every time, Peg-leg. No, it's Peleg. Peleg. For it says, "For in his days the earth was divided." That's not topology-wise. That was when the language confusion took place. He was alive when the Tower of Babel all took place. And his brother's name was Jokan, or Joktan. From Joktan comes the Arabs. The whole Arab line of people come from Joktan. And Joktan became the father of Almadad and Sheplah and this other one, all these, and I can't pronounce all those, except down in verse 29. Ophir, we know that there was gold in Ophir. Havilah actually is over toward Egypt, and Jobab, and all these were the sons of Joktan, who were what we know today as Arabs. Now their settlement extended from Meshah as you go towards Sephar, the hill country, to the east. These are the sons of Shem, according to their families, according to their language, by their lands, according to their nations. So Shem's descendants is all the yellow on this map. And we see they all congregate around what we know today as Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, all that area there. The Persian Gulf and Iraq and Iran. So now, just because we've said that, I need to add this in, just because generally speaking we said Japheth's descendants went this way, Ham's went that way, Shem's went that way, that doesn't mean that every single one of them went. They didn't go in mass. Some of them went in different places. In fact, I've got one of the other maps I've got at home shows some different ones. For instance, there was one, and I can't spot it right off, that actually of Shem's line who went down into Africa and Egypt area. So they didn't go in mass, but generally those are the areas that they went to. And so again, that'd make a good study in your spare time. So then 32, as I read, sums up the whole genealogies of Noah's son. And just to throw this in here, some of the commentaries that I studied mentioned that in these genealogies we have 70 nations represented. If you add them all up, there's 70 nations. And a lot of the commentaries will go into the fact that the number 70 plays a great role in Israel's history. And in fact, it does. In the, I forget what it's called, the study of numbers in Hebraic thought, means the number 70 means a complete and perfect witness. So think about this. In addition to these 70 nations, there were 70 Israelite people who came down to Egypt during the time of the famine, when they came down to Joseph. Daniel's prophecies is about the 70 weeks. The Jews were in captivity 70 years. The Sanhedrin had 70 elders. The Septuagint was translated by 70 elders in 70 weeks. And the temple was destroyed by Rome in 70 AD. Whether that means anything or not, I mean, it's just interesting to know. Some of the commentaries say that the genealogies only include 70 nations in order to make it 70. I don't buy that. I believe the genealogies match these. These match the ones in Chronicles, and then the ones that go all the way down into Matthew and Luke, they match. So anyway, I believe they're true. So any thoughts or questions before we jump into chapter 11?
Thinking about how the family spreads out and how the lineage is horizontal, it's like a family tree. Like, I'm number 8 of 9, and so if you take all my siblings,
right,
and you go down, and not all of us ended up in the same place. We are in Ohio and New Jersey and Michigan and Columbia.
Well,
so the Bible comes alive to me in that way.
Yeah.
Because I'm from a big family.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes you can see things depending on your own personal experience. That just, as you said, makes that come alive to you. So, yeah. So now coming to chapter 11, this fourth Toledot winds up. We have the details of an incident that is only, as we said, alluded to in chapter 10, but we jumped ahead so let you in on the backstory. But this is the fourth major incident in the first section of Genesis. If you remember from our introduction, we said that Genesis was divided into 2 sections, chapters 1 through 11, and then chapters 12 through 50. In chapters 1 through 11, it's divided up into 4 major incidences. We have the creation, the fall, the flood, and the dispersion of nations. In the second half, it is all about 4 people: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And many times I've described it as when we start with Abraham, you have like what we're studying now, we have like this river of humanity, but then when we come to chapter 12, a tributary breaks off of that, and that is Abraham. And then the rest of the Bible is only about that. There will be interactions with the main river from time to time, but the Bible is about that tributary line of Abraham and his descendants down through the Messiah. So, but verse 1 begins with what was. Now, the whole earth used the same language and the same words. Now, your translation was saying the same speech. Not only did they have the same language, but they had the same vocabulary. That's important because they were able to communicate. If you have two people that may speak the same language, but if they have different sets of vocabulary, you may not be fully able to understand. They had the same words and they had the same language. So the question may come up, what was that language? Well, I believe it would be what would be known as Hebrew. I mean, if you're going to confuse all the languages and you're going to keep one and change all the other ones, which one are you going to keep? You're going to keep the one that follows on down through the rest of the Bible, the Hebrew. But just as an interesting sidebar here, there is a prophecy in Zephaniah chapter 3 verse 9, when God is restoring his people, he will restore one common language. I got to do a little more research on that. I'm thinking it might be that in the millennium we'll speak one common language.
It's not going to be Spanish.
No, it'll be Hebrew.
It follows through.
Yeah. The one you started with is going to be the one you end up with.
Oh, my.
Hebrew, probably.
Didn't Jesus and his disciples speak Aramaic?
They did. They could speak Hebrew, but they spoke Aramaic. Aramaic was the language that, we talk about Koine Greek being the merchant language or the common language of the New Testament. Well, in the Old Testament, after the captivity into Babylon, that's where Aramaic became the common language. They would speak their other languages, but Aramaic would be the common language. We might say the merchant language that allowed everybody to communicate. So in Jesus' day, most people spoke Aramaic. The priests would speak Hebrew. And, of course, everybody would speak some Greek in order to be able to communicate. That's why when Jesus was crucified and they put on that placard, they put it in three languages: Latin, which was the Roman language; Greek, which was the universal language; and in Aramaic, which was the language of the common people. There. So that's what they spoke. But it'll go back to one. So I just thought that was interesting. I didn't know that. But verse 1 was what was. Verse 2 gives us where they were and where they went. And it came about as this is all these people, as they journeyed eastward, that would be from Ararat, where the ark settled, that they found a plain, a level area in the land of Shinar, between the rivers. And they settled there. Problem was they weren't supposed to settle. We don't know how much time passed since the end of chapter 9 to the beginning of chapter 11, but we see a problem right off. The King James Version says that they dwelt there. Anybody remember what we've said about the word dwell?
Settle down.
Settle down and what? Be comfortable. Make yourself at home. When you dwell somewhere, in the Psalms, when you dwell in the shadow of the Most High, you're comfortable. It's where you need to be. And sadly, though, in Revelation, many people dwelt there. They were the ones that rebelled. But to dwell means to settle down, make yourself at home, is the way I've described it. So they settled there. And they weren't supposed to settle as a people until they filled the earth. Chapter 9, verse 1 said, "And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." And then verse 7 of chapter 9, "And as for you, be fruitful and multiply, populate the earth abundantly and multiply in it." So they weren't supposed to settle as a people until they'd fill the earth. So they traveled east from the mountain range of Ararat back toward the land where perhaps they'd come from to start with, and they settled in the land between the rivers. Now, whether these rivers were the Tigris and Euphrates that are mentioned as coming out of Eden, or whether they just gave those two rivers that name, we don't know. But it was a plain that was perhaps like what Noah and his sons had told them. Hey, this looks just like where it was before the flood. So that's where they settled. That's where they ended up. That's in the area of modern day Iraq. But just let me take a moment to interject what's going on behind the scenes here. In chapter 3, verse 15, God told Satan that there was one coming who would crush his head. The seed of the woman would destroy the seed of the serpent. That's the promise. That's the gospel. From that moment on, Satan set about to stop that from happening. Plan A, kill the seed. When that didn't work, kill the first seed. When that didn't work, plan B, corrupt the whole line. When that didn't work, now he's up to plan C, have them worship something besides God. Have them worship something that would be a corrupted version of the seed of the woman. I mean, that's a whole other study in itself. We will not have time to get into that. But man, I would love to go down that rabbit trail. But it was a corrupted version. You know, how many times we have, when we were studying Revelation, how many times we had what we called the bizarro world or Satan's opposites. You know, you have the bride of Christ, you have the great harlot. You have my body given for you, we have my body, my choice. I mean, there's a whole pile of those. In fact, a friend from Tuesday morning sent me one this past week. I mean, I knew this, but I had never really put it in these terms before. The rainbow flag that we see everywhere has 6 colors in it. God's rainbow has 7. 6 is the number of man, 7 is the number of God. I mean, you could go on and on with these things. But the point is, have them worship a corrupted version of the seed of the woman. So we come to verse 3. And they said to one another, come. That word come there means put your mind to it. Put it in your mind. Come. Let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they used brick for stone and they used tar for mortar. So the first thing they did, they made a decision to stay there. We like it here. It's nice. It's level. It's, the weather is good.
It's probably fertile too.
Probably, it is the Fertile Crescent after all. So let us. It says us. But who's really leading things? Nimrod. Well, Satan, yes, but on a physical level. Nimrod, we saw that. All the commentaries say it's Nimrod. Why do you think it doesn't say Nimrod here? Any idea?
People may have already known.
They would have known.
But
But why does the Bible not give him credit for it? I just gave you the clue there.
Because it's the Bible.
Because it's the credit. It would give him the name that he so desperately wanted, the name for himself. So it says they. By the way, the earliest mention of Babylon in history, in any recorded history that we know of, comes about in an incident that was said to have taken place in 2700 BC, when the ruler Sargon I built a temple there. That's about the same time frame. So it's just interesting. But they settled in a place that didn't have much in the way of building materials. So they took it on themselves to make it happen. And commentators mention that stone is made by God, but brick is made by man. But they took it on themselves. We'll find a way to do it. And so, now, verse 4. Now, here's the whole thing in a nutshell. Verse 4 is the key verse. Verse 4 says, and they said, come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach into heaven, and let us make for ourselves a name, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. So let's break that down. Come, same word as in verse 3. Come, put it in your mind, come together. Let us build for ourselves. We've seen that so many times in our studies, that when you hear something like that, it's an internal decision. This is not something God told them to do. Let us do this for ourselves, build for ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach to heaven. And let us make for ourselves a name. The word Shem is the word that means name. Let us make for ourselves a Shem. We don't need that Shem. We don't need the one that Shem worships. Let's make for ourselves a Shem. Lest, and this is what they were afraid of, lest we be scattered over the face of the earth. I mean, that is pure, deliberate rebellion. I mean, this is not accidental. It is emphatic and it is on purpose. Remember, Nimrod was the in-your-face guy to God. But let's talk a moment about what they're building. It says first they were building a city. And then it says a tower. We've always heard this story as the Tower of Babel. Anybody know that there was a city there? No. We don't think anything about the city. But actually, you go back to verse 10 of chapter 10, he was building a kingdom. And in that kingdom was a city and a tower. But let me ask you this question. When you've heard this story or this account in your growing up, why did you think what were you told, or why did you think they were building this tower?
To reach God.
To reach God.
To reach God.
Yeah.
I must be
I don't think they were.
No,
I
of course.
When you say that, that's like, no, that couldn't have been it. But yet,
Well, in that sense, to reach God, I must be the only one that thought they were building it to get above another possible flood.
Yeah, I remember.
I remember.
Reading that.
Yeah, that I thought that's why they were building it so high to reach to God, to reach to the heaven. It says the tower whose top will reach into heaven. I always thought, and maybe this was just something I thought as a child, but I thought it was to, if there was ever another flood, they'd be well above it. But God had promised there wouldn't be another flood.
totally.
So that couldn't be what it was at all. But the real reason, as we said, was not that at all. The real reason was, as Satan put it, remember he's the one that's behind Nimrod, Satan put it in Isaiah 14 verse 13, I will ascend to heaven. So that's what they're doing. Nimrod, was after achieving godlike power and authority. Now, most translations say that the tower will reach heaven or reach unto heaven. But the words will reach in my translation, and maybe some of yours, is in italics, telling you that it's not there in the original. So it literally says a tower whose top, and this word for top is the word that means leader. It's a tower whose leader will reach heaven. Now it makes sense. The tower in the city was for worship. Remember that temple that Sargon the First built? This is the beginning of all false religions. As I said, there's a whole teaching on false religions beginning here that we just don't have time to dig into. But this is the birthplace of all false religions. You can trace, and I've heard several different teachings on it, read it in commentaries. You can trace every false worldly religion back to here. This is the birthplace. And by the way, the word Babel, which actually Babel doesn't mean confusion. Babel sounds like a Hebrew word that means confusion. The word Babel actually means gate of God. So it's the tower to the gate of God. But Nimrod wanted to combine everything there. The city, that's the politics. The tower, that's the religion. The people, that's the name or the economy. This was the original one world order. Cain, as we said earlier, was supposed to be a wanderer, but he said, I'll show God, I'll build a city. And the descendants of Noah were to fill the earth, but no, they settled in Shinar. And they were set about to build a city and a tower to make for ourselves a name. We will be famous, they said. But you read this whole account and you don't know anybody's names. Nimrod's name wasn't given. So what did God do? Look at verse 5. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. Now, you may not pick up on the irony here. But Nimrod wanted to build a tower unto heaven that would reach heaven. But God had to come down and see it. Here, let me get my magnifying glass out. I mean, God is a master at sarcasm. So verse 6, and God made 3 observations. And the Lord said, behold, they are one people. They are not in nation, they are one people. And they all have one people, and they all have the same language. And this is what they began to do. There's that word began. And this is what they began to do. That's number 2. And then number 3, and now nothing which they propose to do will be impossible for them. And so like chapter 1 verse 26 and chapter 3 verse 22, there was a divine council meeting. And a decision was made. Verse 7, let us, this is the Trinity, let us go down and there confuse their language that they may not understand one another's speech. And then God did it. Verse 8, so the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. So what did Nimrod do? He went up to Assyria. We see that from chapter 10. And then we have a summary statement. Therefore, its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole earth. And from there, the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the earth. God had told them to scatter, and they rebelled. And then God scattered them over the face of the earth. And then we're given the line of the descendants of Shem, the one whose God was the Lord, all the way down to the one whom God would call, Abram or Abraham. And so we're going to stop there. We're not really going to dig into these because we'll do this again this fall. We'll pick back up there. But let me add this. I've heard several teachers say, and I've read in several commentaries, and I've repeated it myself, and I just did a few moments ago, that all false religions came from the Tower of Babel. The one thing I couldn't figure out was why all these false religions called their gods different names. Duh, the languages were changed. I don't know why I never picked up on that till just this afternoon. The languages were changed. That's why all the different gods have different names. You have Baal, you have Marduk, you have Sargon, you have all these different gods. Dagon, because the different nations named them different things because their languages were different. This life's judgment was for trying to establish a world order. God had given them rules for the divine governing in chapter 9, verses 1 through 7, but they didn't want God's covenant. They wanted their own rule. So God confused their languages and scattered them throughout the world. They didn't want to scatter, but God scattered them. And as I was writing that reminded me of Philippians 2, verse 9, where it says that every knee will bow before the Lord. And John Wesley said, every knee will bow, either with love or with trembling. But it will bow. Then God chose one line, down to one family, down to one man, and they still didn't want God to rule. They wanted a king, just like every other nation. And then the true king came, and they didn't want him either. But someday that will change. And so that's where we'll leave it, and we'll pick up with this genealogy of Shem as we pick up in the fall. So, anything you want to add or share?
Well, it's just a picture of parenthood. My kids said something because they didn't want X to happen. Well, guess what's going to happen now? X is happening.
Yeah, exactly. yeah. That's exactly the way it is. Yeah, between us and God and our kids and us. Yeah. Anything else?
Betty, can you repeat city, politics, tower, religion?
Well,
you said the city is the politics, tower was the religion.
And the people was the economy. Or the people represented a name, which was the economy. The 3 things that you need to have a civilization. Politics, religion, and economy. Anything? All right, well, let's pray. Although this has been a great study, and I have so enjoyed digging into this, and so many rabbit trails I wanted to